Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel for 42 years. During his reign, Saul ruled over Israel and fought against their enemies on every side. Saul would do as the Lord instructed, and God gave them victory over their enemies every time. But as time went on, Saul became confident in his own ability to rule and began doing as he pleased, rather than obeying the words of the Lord. One day the Lord said to Samuel,
"I regret that I made Saul king. He has turned away from me and does not obey my instructions."
The following day, Samuel went to Saul and said, "You have not obeyed the Lord. Therefore, since you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king over Israel." Even though Saul begged and pleaded to remain king, Samuel told Saul, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, because you do not keep his commands. Now the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and will appoint him as king over the people of Israel." From that time on, Samuel never saw Saul again, though he mourned for him. One day, the Lord said to Samuel,
"How long are you going to mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? I'm sending you to Bethlehem to a man named Jesse. I have chosen one of his sons to be king."
Samuel took oil and traveled to Bethlehem to anoint the one whom God had chosen. As soon as he arrived, he found the man named Jesse. He asked him to bring all his sons before him. As soon as Samuel saw his first son, Eliab, he thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is standing right here before us." But the Lord said to Samuel,
"He is not the one. Do not look on his appearance or his height, for the Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart."
7 of Jesse's sons passed before Samuel, but each time the Lord did not choose one to become king of the people of Israel. Finally, Samuel asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?"
"They're still the youngest," Jesse answered, "but
"He's tending to the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him, for we will not sit down until he arrives." When the boy arrived, Samuel saw that he had beautiful eyes and handsome features. Then the Lord said,
"Rise and anoint him. He is the one."
So Samuel took the oil and anointed the young boy named David in the presence of his brothers. From that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came on David as the anointed future king of Israel, chosen by God. Saul and the Israelites continued to go to war to defend themselves against other enemy nations. One day, an enemy called the Philistines provoked the Israelites to war. The Philistines came to Judah and pitched their camp on a hill with the valley down below. The Philistines had a giant and fearsome warrior named Goliath. He was over 9 feet tall and wore scale armor that weighed 125 pounds. He was so strong that his sword weighed 15 pounds. When the Israelites saw that the Philistines had set up camp on the hill in Judah, they assembled their own warriors on the hill opposite the Philistines. Every single day and night, Goliath would come down from the hill in front of the Israelites and take a stand. He would yell insults and taunt all the Israelite warriors. Goliath did this for 40 days and nights, and soon the Israelite warriors were filled with fear and dread of this giant Philistine. No one among the Israelites was brave enough to fight him. During this standoff, Jesse of Bethlehem asked his son, David to take food and supplies to his 3 older brothers who were warriors for King Saul in the battle against the Philistines. As soon as David entered the camp of the Israelites, he saw his 3 older brothers standing in the battle lines facing the Philistines. David left his things with the baggage keeper and ran to his brothers. Just as he reached them, Goliath stepped out from his battle line and began to taunt and insult all the warriors of Israel. But when the Israelites saw Goliath, instead of charging into battle, they all fled in fear for their lives. When David saw this, he asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" The men replied, "The king will give great wealth to the man who kills this giant warrior. He will also give his daughter in marriage to him, and his family will not have to pay taxes in Israel." King Saul was told that David was talking to his warriors about the matter, so he sent for him. David said to King Saul, "Let no man's heart have terror or fear on account of this giant. Your servant will go and fight him." But Saul replied, "You are not able to fight against this Philistine. You are young, and he has fought many battles since he was your age." David said, "I have tended my father's sheep as a young boy, and whenever a lion or bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and attacked it and rescued the lamb. If I can kill a lion and a bear, then I can do the same to this Philistine who has dared to taunt the armies of the living God." Then David said, "The Lord, who has protected me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, will protect me from the hand of Goliath." Saul answered, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul placed armor and a bronze helmet on David for protection. David attached his sword over his armor and tested it to see if he could move well. But David was not used to the weight of the armor and took it off. Then he took his staff in his hand and went to the stream and chose 5 smooth stones and put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag. With his sling and 5 smooth stones, he approached the Philistine giant. Goliath walked toward David, and when he saw him, he sneered at him, saying,
"You're nothing more than a kid. Who do you think I am? A dog that you come at me with sticks? Come here,"
he said.
"I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field to feast on."
With great courage, David said, "You come at me with a sword, a spear, and a shield, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the bodies of the Philistine army to be eaten by the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field, and the whole world will know there is a God in Israel. Then all will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." This enraged the Philistine giant, and he came towards David to kill him with his sword. As David ran toward Goliath, he reached into his bag and put 1 smooth stone into his sling and slung it, striking Goliath on his forehead. The stone sank deep into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. David ran and stood over Goliath. He took his sword and plunged it into his body, and after he killed Goliath, he cut off his head. When the Philistine army saw this, they turned and ran in fear for their lives from the army of Israel. As soon as David returned from killing Goliath, he was brought before King Saul. That day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his home. As David, Saul, and the army of Israel returned from the battle with the Philistines, women came out from all the towns of Israel, joyfully singing and dancing, saying, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." This angered Saul, and from then on, a bitter root of jealousy entered his heart. Because of David's great success in whatever Saul sent him to do, Saul promoted him to a high rank in the army. But for Saul, his bitter heart of jealousy would only continue to grow. This would be the beginning of many difficult and fearful times in the life of the courageous warrior and future king, David. During the early days of service to King Saul, David and Jonathan, King Saul's son, became the closest of friends. Jonathan loved David as a brother and cared deeply for his future. Unfortunately, the more success David had on the battlefield, the more jealous Saul became. One day, out of sheer hatred, Saul hurled his spear at David, trying to pin him to the wall. Even though David was able to escape, he lived in fear of an attack by King Saul. Saul even devised a plan for Jonathan and his servants to kill David. But when Jonathan reminded his father of all the great things that David had accomplished for the kingdom, he decided not to kill David. When David heard of this plan, his heart was in anguish, and he came before the Lord and cried out in prayer, "Deliver me from my enemies, O God. Protect me from those who rise up against me. Deliver me from evildoers, and save me from bloodthirsty men. O my strength, I watch for you and sing praise to you. O God, you are my fortress, my loving God." The next day, Jonathan came to David, and they came up with a plan to find out if King Saul had still planned on killing David. Jonathan told David, "Go out to the field near us and hide beside the rock known as Azel. Then tonight, when we sit down to eat dinner, and my father sees that your place is empty, he will ask me where you are. And I will tell him you are traveling to visit your family. If he answers well, then I know you will be safe. If he answers in anger, then I will let you know so that you can escape. If the king does not intend to kill you, I will come out to the field and shoot 3 arrows to the side of the rock where you are hiding. I will say to the boy who will fetch the arrows for me, 'Look, the arrows are to the side of the rock. Bring them to me.' If you hear these words, you will know that you are safe from my father's anger. But if my father intends to harm you, I will shoot the arrows far beyond you, and by this you will know that you must leave in order to save your life from my father's wicked plans to kill you." That evening during dinner, King Saul noticed that David was not at his place at the table. When Jonathan told him that David was visiting his family in Bethlehem, Saul became so angry that he hurled his spear at his own son to kill him. Even though the spear missed Jonathan, he knew that his father intended to kill David. The next morning, Jonathan went out to the field with a young boy who would fetch his arrows. Jonathan's heart grieved at having to send David away, but his love for David was so great that he knew he must protect him from his father. Jonathan shot an arrow far beyond the rock where David was hiding, and then sent the young boy to get it. As soon as the boy returned with the arrow, he sent him away, and David came out from behind the rock. As David approached Jonathan, he fell to his knees and bowed before him. Then they embraced as brothers and wept together. They both knew that David would have to escape to save his life. David fled for his life into the wilderness of the hill country and hid among the caves. King Saul continued to search for him, but did not find him. During this time, many men heard where David was hiding and decided to join forces with him. One day, Saul got word that David and his men were hiding in the strongholds of En-Gedi. Saul took 3,000 chosen men from Israel to search for David and his men. During the search, Saul went into the opening of a cave to relieve himself, and David and his men were hiding deep in the cave. When David's men saw King Saul by himself, they said, "This is what the Lord meant when he said to you, 'I will give your enemy into your hands to deal with as you wish.'" Now David's heart was noble, and he would never kill an anointed king. So he quietly crept up behind King Saul and cut off a small piece of his robe. But soon afterward, his heart was bothered by what he had done. Saul left the cave to go on his way. David came out of the cave shortly after Saul left and called to him, "My lord, my king!" When Saul looked behind him, David bowed before him and said, "Today your eyes have seen that God has given you into my hands, but I had mercy on you and refused to kill you. Look at this piece of your robe that I cut off. You can see that I have no evil plans for your life, even though you continually try to kill me. God, therefore, will be our judge, and he will decide between us. May he see my cause and deliver me from your hand." When Saul saw that it was David, he began to weep and said, "The Lord delivered me into your hand today, and yet you did not kill me when you had the chance. May the Lord therefore reward you with good. I know that someday you will be king over all Israel. so please swear to me that you will not cut off my descendants." David made this promise to King Saul, and then returned to the strongholds in En-gedi, while Saul returned home. A period of time passed, but Saul still had a bitter and jealous heart towards David. Saul heard that David and his men were camped in the wilderness of Ziph, so he took 3,000 of his best men and went to search for David to kill him. When David heard that Saul and his army were camped close to where he and his men were hiding, David and a few of his best warriors snuck into Saul's camp at night. Saul was sleeping on the ground with his spear stuck in the ground beside his head, along with his water jug. The king was safely surrounded by his strongest soldiers, but God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Saul and all his men, and David was able to take Saul's spear and water jug without waking anyone. As they left the camp, David and his men stood on a hill a short distance from the camp, and David yelled down to Saul's men, "What kind of men are you, that you did not guard your king and lord when we came into your camp to destroy him? As you can see, we have the king's spear and water jug that laid beside his head." Saul recognized David's voice and asked, "Is that your voice, David?" David replied, "Yes, it is, my lord the king. Why are you pursuing me again? What have I done against you to deserve this?" Then Saul replied, "I have sinned today and done a foolish thing. Once more, you had the chance to take my life and did not do it." When David heard this, he said, "The Lord will reward each man for his righteousness and faithfulness. The Lord delivered you into my hands today, and I refused to touch his anointed. Therefore, I pray my own life will be highly valued in the sight of the Lord, and he will deliver me from all my troubles." Saul answered, "David, my son, may you be blessed and accomplish great and mighty things." Then they parted, and each went their own way. This was the last time that David would ever hide and fear death from the hand of King Saul. Shortly after, King Saul and 3 of his sons, including Jonathan, were killed near Mount Gilboa during a fierce battle between the Philistines and the Israelites. Many years would pass and many battles would occur before David was ready to become king. That day came when King Saul and 3 of his sons, including Jonathan, were killed in a battle between the Israelites and the Philistines. When David learned about the deaths of King Saul and his sons, his heart was filled with great sorrow. David would never forget Jonathan, whom he loved as a brother. David knew the time had come for him to take the position of king. The Lord instructed him to go to Judah in the town of Hebron. David, his family, and all the men who followed him traveled to Hebron, and there he was crowned king of Judah. At that time, the tribes of Israel split into 2 groups. One group was called Israel, and the other group was called Judah. After Saul's death, Abner, the commander of King Saul's army, brought in Saul's son, Ishbosheth, and made him king over Israel. So Israel had Ishbosheth as their king, and Judah had David as their king. For 7.5 years, there was continual war between Israel and Judah. Judah and the house of David grew stronger and stronger, while Israel, led by their commander Abner, grew weaker and weaker. When Abner saw this, he went before the elders of Israel and said, "For a long time you've wanted to make David your king. Now do it! For the Lord promised him, 'It will be by David that I will rescue my people Israel from the hand of all their enemies.'" So all the elders of Israel went to David in Hebron, where they anointed David as king over all of Israel. As king of Israel, David wanted to do one very important thing, and that was to bring the Ark of God, which contained the 2 stone tablets of God's covenants, back to Jerusalem. David gathered 30,000 chosen men of Israel and brought the Ark of God back to Jerusalem and placed it in a sacred tent. David was a man after God's own heart, and he ruled with strength and courage. In the years ahead, David would bring many victories and great peace to the land of the Israelites by following the commands of God. But he also made a serious and painful mistake that would result in harsh and bitter consequences for him and his future descendants. It all began one evening as he was walking on the roof of his palace that overlooked the city of Jerusalem. He saw a married woman named Bathsheba bathing in her house below. She was so beautiful that he sent messengers to her home and asked her to come to the palace. She stayed the night with King David, and the next morning he sent her home. Later, Bathsheba sent word to David that she was pregnant. David knew that he had committed a terrible sin in the sight of God, but what he did next only made it worse. When he found out that Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, was fighting in battle for him, he sent for him to come to the palace. When Uriah arrived, he refused to go to his own home and slept in the entrance of the palace with all the rest of the servants. When David saw that Uriah would not go home, he sent word to his commander, Joab, to place Uriah on the front lines of the battle where the fighting was most fierce. Just as King David had planned, the next day Uriah was placed on the front lines and soon killed in battle while defending Israel. Bathsheba mourned for her husband, and after her period of mourning was over, David sent for Bathsheba, and they were soon married. David's sinful behavior greatly displeased the Lord. Therefore, he sent a prophet named Nathan to King David. Nathan told David, "There were 2 men in a certain town, one rich and one poor. The rich man had many sheep and cattle, but the poor man only had one little ewe lamb that he had bought. He raised it and grew it up with his children. He loved the little lamb so much that it shared his food, drank from his cup, and slept in his arms. A visitor came to the rich man's house, and instead of taking one of his own animals to feed the visitor that night, he took the ewe lamb from the poor man to feed to his visitor. When David heard this story, he became enraged and said, 'As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over for doing such a thing to another man.' Then Nathan the prophet said to David, 'You are that man. The Lord God of Israel says, was it not enough that I anointed you to be king over all Israel? I gave you everything you could have ever wanted, and I would have given you even more. Why have you hated the word of the Lord by doing such evil in his eyes? Now, because of what you have done, there will always be trouble and conflict in your family.' Then David said to Nathan, 'I have sinned greatly against my Lord.' And Nathan replied, 'You are not going to die, because the Lord has forgiven your sin. But because of your sin, your son born to you by Bathsheba will not live.' David's son was born. 7 days later, the child died. David and Bathsheba were heartbroken. About a year later, Bathsheba became pregnant again and gave birth to another son. They named him Solomon, and the Lord loved him very much. David reigned for 40 years, doing what was just and right for all people. He loved God and walked faithfully before the Lord with all of his heart and soul.